Well, how many of you think you can guess what I have in my bag? Anybody got a guess? Lunch is a good guess. Here it is, just in case I need it. My goggles and my snorkel. And I even brought an extra snorkel just in case. So if anybody thinks they might need it, here they are. Actually, I've already had one child this morning come up to me and say, "Mr. Steve, where are you going to stand on the stage?" I was kind of worried. That was you. That's right, Trenton. It was you. A lot of work went into setting the stage up and getting ready for Vacation Bible School. I hope that when you see the effort that's been put in here, you'll know that there's been equal effort put into designing every part of Vacation Bible School for this year, and that you will invite your neighbors, the children in your neighborhood, family, friends, people to come to it. It's going to be spectacular. A lot of work's gone into it. So I hope that you'll support it. It begins tomorrow night. It's going to be great. Blues singer Bessie Smith died saying, "I'm going, but I'm going in the name of the Lord." William Henry Seward, architect of the Alaska Purchase, was asked if he had any final words. He said, "Nothing, only that love one another." Leonardo da Vinci was overly modest. His dying words are recorded as, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have." Actor Michael Landon, best known for Little House on the Prairie and Highway to Heaven, died of cancer in 1991. His family gathered around his bed, and his son said it was time to move on, and he said, "You're right. It's time. I love you all." When Groucho Marx was dying, he let out one last quip. "This is no way to live," he said. According to Steve Jobs' sister Mona, the Apple founder's last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." When I think about the way that my own mother passed, she died from dementia. So I don't really have last words, and probably won't have last words from my own father because he's also dying from dementia. But I do think that if I were to have gathered around the bedside of my mother and she would have had her mind and she would have given me some last words, they would have been powerful to me and meant a lot to me. When the time drew near for David to die, David in the Bible, he gave a charge to Solomon his son, saying, "I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, act like a man, observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws, regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you go, that the Lord may keep his promise to me. Your descendants watch how they live. And if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart, with all of their soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." You have to know that these last words would have been very precious to Solomon as he's there and he calls his son in and he urges him to live a life of faithfulness to God throughout his life. Last words, they're treasured. Last words are irreplaceable. Last words truly are cherished. As the events of the cross are drawing near, the personal teaching moments of Jesus are becoming fewer to his disciples. We've been studying at kind of a slow pace the book of Matthew, and now we're near the end of the book. And the teaching moments that Jesus has with the disciples are becoming fewer And because of that, I believe they're in many ways more precious. The last words of Jesus that Matthew chooses to tell are these final lessons in chapter 24. In this chapter, Matthew chooses Jesus' answers to questions about the future. Now, we're indebted to John because John gives us, John 14 through 17, Jesus' last words and teachings at the Last Supper. But Matthew chooses this as his last teaching discourse to present to us. Now, before we read it, I want you to listen very carefully. I'm going to try to summarize the whole, and I'm used to walking around. This is going to get to me. But I want to try to summarize. If you could listen for this section, you'll understand the whole rest of the lesson, because today's lesson is a little more academic. It's a little more historical. The disciples are walking around in Jerusalem, and the disciples say, "Wow, look how beautiful the city is." And Jesus says, "Do you see all these buildings? They're all going to be torn down." And later on the Mount of Olives, the disciples say, "Tell us more about this. Tell us more about this destruction." In their minds, it's very likely that they thought that the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming or the coming of the Messiah were simultaneous events. They didn't know the difference between this destruction of Jerusalem and then the future second coming of Jesus. They saw them as different events. So as Jesus unravels this for us in Matthew 24, he goes back and forth trying to pull each part of this strand apart so that we can understand it, and they can too. So basically, Jesus' answer is this. When the destruction of Jerusalem comes, there will be warning signs. Pay attention to them. And when the destruction warning signs come, flee to the hills. Help the pregnant women. The destruction is going to be complete. It's going to be terrible. But there is another coming, the second coming. And at that coming, there will be no sign. The sign will be the coming itself. It will be suddenly. It will be the time when no one expects. So be watchful. Now that's the lesson. Let's go through it one at a part at a time. Let's read it first. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him and called attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars, rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, and he who stands firm to the end will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of the house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, Those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is, out in the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there are vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with powerful and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn this from the fig tree. As soon as the twigs get tender and the leaves come out, you will know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you will know it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jason, would you do me a favor? Would you go to my office and grab, it's a gray book. It's Josephus' book. It's either on my main table or on the desk. Thank you. Basically, the disciples asked three different questions. When will this happen? What will the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? It's very appropriate that the disciples began to think now about the future. Jesus has told them, I'm about to leave, and although they don't understand it exactly, they're mixed with these confusing thoughts that perhaps the glory of the kingdom is to come now, and we are to sit on thrones and to help rule with Jesus. Mixed with the teaching of Jesus that I'm going to be leaving, and I'm going to be going away, and I'm going to be dying and be raised. Later on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come to Jesus and ask for more details. Of course, they did not know about Jesus' second coming, and initially thought all the prophecies of Daniel and others would come to pass now, given that Jesus is there. They seem to forget always, as they always did, Jesus' teaching on his betrayal and arrest and crucifixion and rising again. So the disciples were confused and were hoping for inside information about what they thought was about to happen to them. Oh, good. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Jesus speaks immediately about the destruction that will happen in AD 70 when the Romans under Emperor Titus sacked the city and destroyed the temple. These two events are separate. All right, so we're going to divide the lesson into two different parts. The rest will continue tonight. Watchfulness for the destruction of Jerusalem and watchfulness for the end of time. What can we learn from this? It's this. We need to think about the future. We live in the present. We are not to worry about tomorrow, but we must consider the future. And Jesus here speaks of a current event, the destruction of Jerusalem, to come in 40 years or so from the time he's teaching. Jesus says this generation will see this. But we must think about our eternity, our future. I have a few pictures. A lot of these I've never shown you before. They're from years ago when Susan and I visited Jerusalem and the Holy Lands. This is a model of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. It's pretty big. I would say it's bigger than this stage. It's very large. And you can see here there's a rail that goes all the way around it. There's a rail over here. And you can walk all the way around it, and you can see the way the city would have looked during the time of Christ. And this, I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong button. This is the temple here, this whole structure right here. Okay. Oops. So think about then the abomination of desolation that Jesus refers to. The abomination of desolation is essentially whenever the temple is defiled by the Romans. When you see the Romans coming, this abomination of desolation, the desecration of the temple, when you see this coming, it will be a sign to you. That very temple I just showed you a picture of in that map. The reason I wanted to show you this is Herod's palace. Many of the stones that are used in this reconstruction of Herod's palace, or all around Jerusalem, even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, have the stones of the old temple and Temple Mount in them. Now, why is that important? Jesus said not one stone will be left. They'll all be thrown down. And so when all the stones were thrown down, after that, years later, they took all the stones and rebuilt all the buildings. And you can find parts of the old temple, the old Temple Mount, and all those used in buildings throughout the city today. And a lot of them are marked, and you can tell because of the style of them. Here is an example of one of the ancient gates. It has a variety of different kinds of stones throughout it. This is the picture that I took of the western wall, the Wailing Wall. Even when you look at it, you can see the different kinds of stones, the different, the way that they were carved or quarried. Very ancient. Some of them of the old Temple Mount, some not. This section is thought to be really a preserved area of the old Temple Mount, Herod's temple. This was great, by the way. The day that we went there was Bar Mitzvah Day. They had a separation for the men and the women, and there were a lot of women. They were standing on these flimsy old chairs, and they were looking over and watching to see their sons celebrate on this special day, their Bar Mitzvah Day. You can see here, for instance, some of these young boys that are here around. This is a picture taken of Jerusalem from the Garden of Gethsemane. It was stunning. No wonder when the disciples saw the beautiful stones, the beautiful buildings, they were marveling at them. And it's in this moment that Jesus says they're all going to be cast down. It would have been very alarming to them. This is a beautiful picture that could have been similar to what Jesus would have seen on his triumphal entry day. This is from the Mount of Olives, from the top of it. As you look over, and this is the Temple Mount, and this here is the old city of David down here, this area. Beautiful. These, of course, are the tombs on the Mount of Olives, all down here. Not one stone. Not one stone will be left. These things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left on another. They will all be thrown down. And even today, you can see the stones lying around. He explains how they can recognize that it is about to happen and what they should do about it. And even though it will certainly seem to be the end of the age, it isn't. So they should not lose their heads. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, Luke records in Luke chapter 21, that its desolation has come near, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those inside the city must leave it. Those who are in the country must not enter it. Because these are the day of vengeance to fulfill all the things that are written. Woe to the pregnant women and the nursing mothers in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captives into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus, this is non-biblical, but it's historical, describes the events of those days. It's too gruesome to read in a public audience, but I'll just read you a part of it. not the gruesome parts, but it is pretty alarming. The famine was too hard for all other passions. Now imagine the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans, and no food goes in or out of the city for a long time. For what was otherwise worthy of reverence was in this case despised, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do to their infants. And when those who were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. And while they ate after this manner, yet were they not concealed in so doing. But the seditions everywhere came upon them immediately, and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. For when they saw any house shut up, that was to them the signal that the people were in had gotten some food, whereupon they broke open the doors, ran in, took the pieces of what they were eating, almost out of their very throats, and by force the old men who held their food fast were beaten. And if the women hid what they had within their hands, they were torn for doing so. Nor was there any commiseration shown either to the aged or to infants, but they lifted up their children from the ground. And it goes on. That was enough. Terrible times. So when Jesus predicts this abomination of desolation, when he predicts in the future what it was going to be like, we can see here from the historian Josephus that it was exactly as Jesus described, and just as horrible as he described it to be. Now, Jesus does not give the date for the destruction, but he does tell them that it will be within the current generation. Verses 34 and 35, truly I tell you this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now let's talk about for a moment the watchfulness for the end of time. The disciples would have known little or nothing about the second coming of Jesus. To them, Jesus had come, and they were likely anticipating a singular event of epic proportions. Right now, that same week, Jesus attempts to untangle their misconceptions. This comes from, actually, this is pretty comical. This comes from KenCollins.com. It really does. Now, since they brought up the end of the age, Jesus tells them about that too. The most important thing for them to remember is that if someone has to explain it to you, it isn't going to happen. There are no signs other than the event itself. The end of the age is so obvious that even non-believers will recognize it. They will recognize Jesus even though they are seeing him for the first time. They will see, so to speak, the landlord of the universe coming to collect the rent. It happens abruptly at an unexpected time, like a lightning bolt. Listen, when the second coming of Christ comes, there will be no doubt that that's what it is. We don't find anywhere in the Bible where anyone thinks, well, is that an earthquake? Is that a train going by? The events are so stark that everyone is going to know what's happening. So since there are no signs of the end of the age, we have to be ready all the time. We must be prepared all the time. We must be ready even today. Now, this lesson has been a little more historical, a little more academic than some that I do. But Jesus uses these last words to prepare his disciples for the future. He unravels their confusion. He tells them to be ready and to be watchful. And as we read in our scripture reading today, so you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. The lesson for us today is the lesson of watchfulness. The second coming of Jesus is yet to come, nearer all the time, and we must be ready. Now tonight, in tonight's lesson, we're going to spend a little more time thinking about, reflecting upon, and considering the second coming of Jesus. But for this morning, I want you to think for just a moment about the future. Current events will come and go. We may get warning of some of those events about to happen. But there will be no sign, no advanced warning, no last-second preparations when it comes to the second coming of Christ. It will be in the twinkling of an eye. It will be in a single moment. And at that time, preparation time is over. Warning time is over. Repentance time is over. And as Jesus prepares his disciples for the future, he gives them this message of immediacy and urgency. When you go out and you teach other people, you are giving words with eternal consequences. You are giving salvation and hope to people. So that as we will look at tonight, this moment is not a moment of fear, but of anticipation. It is good for us to consider the future and to understand that we need to be watchful and we need to be ready. The beauty is that we still have breath in our lungs today. We can still change. We can still prepare. And if you have anything today you need to make right with God, do it today. Let's stand and encourage you with this song. Will you come?